Thank you so much. It's good to see all of you here. And this is right after lunch. You're still eating, so maybe you're all feeling a little tired. So to just try to wake you up, I'm going to just yell out, "Are you fired up? Are you ready to go?" All right, wonderful. Well, let's talk about great decisions. And first of all, before I introduce our speaker, I want to just give you a little bit of context about great decisions at the Minnesota International Center. But I first want to ask for a show of hands of how many councils have the Great Decisions program in their council. That's great. Well, I would say it's probably about a third of you. So I think that one of the first things that I'd like to say for those of you that don't have it is that Great Decisions is this program, like a book club. It's on 8 current events topics out of New York City. They've been doing it for a very long time. And back in the late 1990s, the World Affairs Councils of America deemed that the Great Decisions program would be one of the flagship programs. And at this time, so back in the late 1990s, the Minnesota International Center, we had a very weak Great Decisions program. We maybe had 12 groups that got the books. They bought the books directly from the Foreign Policy Association in New York City, and they all got together in little groups and had great decisions. But then, in 2001, after 9/11, what we heard from many of our members was they really wanted to have a lot more discussions on foreign policy topics. And it wasn't that they wanted high, top-level speakers. They wanted to sit down and discuss issues themselves. Because they said this is a great way of really better understanding these issues. It's not a luxury to know about the world, it's imperative to know about the world. So we listened to them, and we said, all right, well, how can we really strengthen our Great Decisions program when we maybe we didn't have a lot of funding? But I did give another staff person a little more focus on Great Decisions, and also found 2 volunteers in our community that felt very passionate about being our Great Decisions troubadours and trying to get more people involved. One was a retired Foreign Service officer who had come back to Minnesota, really wanted to give back to the community. And the other was someone who had been in local politics, who really understood the power of civic engagement on global issues. And I think that all of us have a mantra in the work we do, that a wise U.S. foreign policy is based on a well-informed and engaged public. And that's what Great Decisions is. It's I really can't say enough great things about this program. And we're a statewide organization, so one of the reasons why we really loved it is that it's a very portable program. It's got great materials. Every year you've got 8 new current events topics. So there are written materials. They also put out an excellent DVD. And one of the things that a number of councils do is we identify speakers in our communities that can speak on these topics. And so this last year there was a topic on Indonesia. Well, who are some Indonesian nationals that would really love to share their, talk about their country? Cybersecurity, the list goes on and on. I know that many of you have, there are various ways that you use Great Decisions in your councils. But I want to just talk about, what we did. How did we go from 12 councils back in 2000 to 60 councils? 60 Great Decisions groups today. Is that we just put some energy into it and we listened to our community. So we really developed the speakers. We went and talked to the retired Foreign Service officers, saying, would you be willing to be speakers? Many of them were so happy to be able to speak about their expertise, go into the councils. Academics, We went to a lot of our corporations where they had foreign nationals that were interested, and so we built a very impressive speaker roster. We also went and talked to a lot of elected officials that had retired. You know, all these people that really understand why it's so important to know about global issues. Then we talked to partners. This morning we heard from Karen about the importance of partnerships. And we went to a number of different organizations. The Minnesota Humanities Commission was a very interesting talk to us. Libraries, places of worship, they wanted to have this interesting content. We also talked to the Foreign Policy Association, and because Noel Latif is not here, I think we should all jump on it when he does come, because he provided a lot of good financial support early on to, you know, like $5,000 grants to give us seed money in our communities to do more, and that helped a lot. We also did some things with training and training and mentorship. So for every Great Decisions group, there was always someone who was designated a leader. And we provided some training workshops for those leaders. And at the national level, there has been a real push of the Foreign Policy Association to put Great Decisions programming into high schools. So they've been doing training workshops for many years where they will have teachers come to New York for a 4-day program. And so then you get these teachers that have come back, they've learned all about the Great Decisions program, and they're fired up, and they're a multiplier effect, and they can put that into the classroom. And can I just see a show of hands of how many of you send teachers every year to the Great Decisions workshops in New York? Wow. Todd Culpepper. This is something that we've got to continue to promote, because I think we've taken advantage of these kinds of opportunities. Also, something that we started to do 5 years ago was that we would take a Great Decisions topic and turn it into an annual conference. And it not only would be to focus on that topic, but also it would be to provide some workshops and training for Great Decisions leaders, to get people from whoever was involved in Great Decisions to come together and to bond and to hear best practices. You know, just very similar to what we're listening to right now. But that was really energizing. And then we got people to, to help support it. This last month, we had our Great Decisions program on global health. Now, global health is going to be incorporated into a 2013 Great Decisions topic on global threats. So what we were able to do in terms of getting sponsorship was to get, in Minnesota, we've got a medical ally, we've got a lot of medical companies, we've got a lot of people who are very excited about that topic. And for everybody who went to that, they feel that they've already got a leg up on one of the 2013 topics. But the last thing that we did, and this is really what I want to talk to you about today, is finding a media partner. Now, I think everybody in this room really would love to be doing a lot more with the media in our communities. And, we've been doing Great Decisions on a much more focused basis for about 10 years. And I'm pleased to say, in some ways, we have gotten some good press. For example, back in 2002, lo and behold, one day I was called by a journalist from the Wall Street Journal. And she said, I hear that the Minnesota International Center has a great Decisions program, and I want to hear more about what it is that you're doing, because she was writing an article on salons where people were getting together to talk about global issues. So I had a wonderful interview with her, and 2 weeks later, I was pleased to see there was my name, Carol Engebretson Byrne, quoted in the Wall Street Journal. But then the comment was, and even in Minnesota, they're talking about global issues. So, not quite quite as successful as I thought it would be. And another time we got another local newspaper to write a wonderful article about the Great Decisions program. And once it went out, it was great because we had about 70 individuals who contacted us and said, we want to know more about Great Decisions. But it was sort of like the stops and starts, and that's what is sometimes, frustrating about working with the media. Well, there's been a dream that we've had for a number of years about partnering with media on Great Decisions. And this is not my idea at all. In fact, I remember hearing about this in the late 90s from the Milwaukee World Affairs Council, where Carol Bauman, and some of you may remember her from way back, she ran the World Affairs Council in Milwaukee, and she had created a partnership with the Milwaukee Sentinel, where every month the Milwaukee Sentinel took one of those Great Decisions topics, and on their editorial page they wrote an article about that. And then, it really raised the profile of that program. So that was my dream, to always do this. And we have two major newspapers in town, but one is the Star Tribune out of Minneapolis, and I think it's the 16th largest newspaper in the country, a very well-respected newspaper, and I would always, with our World Affairs program speakers, when we bring them into town, oftentimes we will bring them to the editorial board. And I hope that's something that many of you are doing as well, because it's a great way of adding value to your organization and to the community and to the media when you bring in these high-level speakers. So the editorial board knew the Minnesota International Center and built a relationship with them, and then finally we broached this topic of, would you be interested to partner with the Minnesota International Center on Great Decisions? And there was a change in the newspaper. I think they were, and the editorial board, they were very, very receptive to this idea. So 2 years ago, we started this month-long partnership. And the speaker who I'm about to introduce is John Rash, who is on the editorial board of the Star Tribune. He also is a adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota in media and politics. And also, I don't know how he does it because he's got two small kids, but he also has a daily radio program. And so this is someone who is very much in the know, and he has truly been a phenomenal advocate. But this partnership, it's been going on now for almost 2 years, actually about a year. It started last October, and we've got some articles that we're going to share with you later on about what we do. But it's where we are taking a topic every third Saturday of the month. Someone from the Minnesota International Center writes an article about the topic, and then someone from the editorial board writes about that topic, and there's a special spin to it. What have we found? It certainly has raised our profile at the Minnesota International Center. It has raised visibility on these important global issues. It has also helped us with membership. It has helped us with corporate membership. It's given us a lot of credibility. And I think that it is a model. If you have Great Decisions and you're not doing this, it is something that's very easy to replicate. And so I think at this point, I'm going to ask John Rash to come up and speak about this, because I think he's going to give us this media perspective, how we all think that we need the media in order to, raise our profile and the work that we're doing. But I think the refreshing message from John is that the media also really needs us. So with that, I'm going to invite you up, John.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for those kind comments and a very generous introduction, Carol. I really appreciate it, and I certainly appreciate being included here at this event, and certainly appreciate all the attention that you are all bringing to world affairs here. And indeed, I know how much Minnesota has benefited from the Minnesota International Center, and I'm quite confident your communities have commensurately benefited as well. Now, I've been at the Star Tribune on the editorial board, as well as a columnist, since the 2008 election. And, since we're all a little bit bleary-eyed from watching the election, or perhaps listening to the election, or maybe tweeting about the election, or posting the election, or reading about it, or doing it at the same time, and how many of you had multimedia devices going, perhaps even in your hotel room here as you got ready for the conference today? I thought I'd begin today by just talking a little bit about some of the media dynamics and the fragmenting and fracture that have taken place just since the last election. Back when we look at 2008, Facebook had just gone beyond being Ivy League, and now, of course, it's pop culture kudzu that seems to grow and never be stopped, and seems to be altering every aspect of society, certainly including politics. And Twitter was something that birds did in Beijing's Bird Nest Stadium, during the 2008 Olympics, and we found out this morning, not surprisingly, that last night's election set yet another usage record for the social media service. And yet other media have changed since the previous presidential election as well. A new Pew study shows that just since January, the internet increased from 25 to 36% as a regular source for campaign news. Websites and apps from mainstream media organizations, Star Tribune certainly included, are regularly visited by 28% of voters, compared to 19% of online-only sources, where we now have a new kind of poll tax, which is the hourly observations of polls that seem to come out every half hour on the hour, I guess, that seem to hook many a political and journalism junkie. And along with this new media is old media with some newfound relevancy. Late-night comedy shows, for an example, were named by 12%, as many as National Public Radio, as a regular campaign source. And we all know, how many of you routinely watch either The Daily Show or Colbert Report? So, you're well aware how they're able to sneak in a serious side along with the satire, and you think of just the serious punch that was packed along with the punchlines in the super PAC discussions by Stephen Colbert, who exploited and explained how the new campaign finance system worked. And of course, Stephen Colbert, as those of you out there who watch him, he mocks cable TV talk shows, the kind that channel networks Howard Beale, as opposed to the cable news networks, which at least during the news try to emulate Edward R. Murrow. It seems like they end up kind of in somewhere in between most of the time. They did have the top spot in the Pew poll, 41%. But like cable news talk shows, its hostile hosts can often be heard on talk radio, loudly. And that isn't to say, however, that talk radio didn't have a significant influence and impact. But one could argue, and certainly a lot of Monday morning, or perhaps Wednesday morning quarterbacks, as they look at the results of the election today, are reading into it that perhaps it was to encourage or enforce an ideological rigidity in people on multiple parts of the ballot, as opposed to allowing candidates to move to the center, where most Americans say they reside. And if you look at local news, 38% said that they got their campaign coverage from there. That was the second in most of usage. I would argue that's a little bit more reflexive tune-in, in that people routinely turn to local news for everything, and certainly get some campaign news along with it, as opposed to any game-changing media moments. And the same could be said for network news. 31% say they regularly tuned in, and yet, however solid its journalism, it too didn't have any media moments that rivaled Katie Couric's interview with Sarah Palin in 2008. And even though there's been a lot of ink spilled, and I guess a lot of tears shed, about local newspapers' challenges, they were named by 23%. And these quadrennial campaigns, if we just look at it from this perspective, are eras in media terms. So I guess I would say, perhaps being a born optimist, that there is remarkable resiliency of newspapers is perhaps what's most notable. But to stay that way, newspapers need to adapt to and adopt some of the technological transformations that have changed campaign coverage these last 4 years and are sure to do so in the next 4 years. But in changing with the times newspapers, and particularly opinion pages, we need to make sure that we don't let these revolutions in production and distribution eclipse the journalism. But even by saying that, it's important to note that newspapers cannot be content with conventional content. To remain relevant, newspapers need to think of new ways to report on and reflect other transcendent trends, including the rapidly developing demographic changes reflected in so many of our communities, and that played such a significant part in last night's vote as well. One of these ways, as Carol mentioned, was to consider a partnership. Now, for all of you who read your regular newspaper, perhaps have written for them as well, partnerships like this are relatively rare for many reasons. Editors want to remain flexible, especially given the ever-changing news narrative. They don't cede space on the page very easy. Op-ed space is like beachfront property. There's only so much of it, and it's certainly valuable, even in these rapidly transformative media times. And indeed, even though, or perhaps because of, the ability to opine online, the amount of submissions that we get continue to hit an all-time record. Because there appears to still be a certain validation in terms of being able to see one's name, ideas, individuals, or institutions reflected on the page. And it's not just walking world affairs. Think when you see an ad for a Hollywood movie that's coming out. They love to run the validation, not of a blogger or someone who's writing about movies online, but the New York Times, Washington Post, Minneapolis Star Tribune as an example. Editors are also afraid of getting locked into topics, or writers, or both, that can't captivate regular readers, let alone draw new ones. So given all of these hurdles that editors would see, why did they decide to partner with the Minnesota International Center? Well, there are several reasons, all of them good, and I thought I'd go through a few for a couple of moments here today. And first is just the nature of the Minnesota International Center itself, and certainly your versions of World Affairs Councils. The MIC is multi-pronged. Rooted in academia, it's built bridges to the business community that would be the envy of nearly any institution, and as a nonprofit understands how that sector is increasingly integral to a cohesive community. And as part of these three pillars of civil society, it's connected and can connect others, including readers. Second, Carol mentioned the Great Decisions program. And using those topics as a monthly theme allows an entry point into other transnational factors. And indeed, I talked about the obsessive observations of the polls a few moments ago. And in terms of foreign policy, and to the degree that it was discussed in the election, instead of trying to read the tea leaves or the polls, one could have just looked at the Great Decisions topics 9 months ago when it's published, and it was remarkably prescient in a way, as they say, written in the headlines. Third, the Minnesota International Center may have a different, perhaps even deeper Rolodex than even our commentary editor, who himself has been around for nearly 40 years, especially on very specific areas of global experience and expertise. Simply put, the MIC has the ability to put better commentators and bring them to us than we could do alone. It's a force multiplier. Fourth, while the MIC is in a way all about politics, it is perceived as completely apolitical. Sure, true to their nature, they certainly favor internationalism over isolationism, but unlike so many other societal sectors, like newspapers, the MIC is not thought of in a partisan way. Fifth, and perhaps most important, the MIC helps the Star Tribune's editorial page remain relevant. In fact, too often there's a perception among people within the media business, newspapers as well, that world affairs are, foreign to our readers. And sure, there are some arcane areas of globalism that do indeed get lost in translation. But in reality, the rapid transformations, as we heard about from some of the communities that were discussed earlier this morning, and certainly Minneapolis and Minnesota, are really and tremendously profound. Back home, for instance, we're just on our latest wave of significant immigration. Now, like many of you, the state that I grew up in Minnesota, was quite different than it is now. In fact, one of the few films, I write about media and politics, I teach about media and politics and write about it for the paper, and so sometimes I can get a perception of how a community or a state or a region is perceived. One of the few films that was made in Minnesota as I grew up is called The Engebretson. Perhaps a few of you maybe remember it. It starred Liv Ullmann and Max von Sydow as Christina and Carl Oscar, all spelled with K's, by the way. Two farmers headed to America's version of sweet Minnesota. And in fact, it seemed that diversity, as I grew up, was a fin that was interspersed along with the dominant Danes and Norwegians and Swedes who rivaled the Germans in population. Well, now, as was mentioned a little bit earlier in the morning, there are more Somalis in Minneapolis than anywhere but Mogadishu. And they join other thriving African communities of Eritreans, Ethiopians, Liberians, and they were preceded by Hmong immigrants from Laos, Cambodians, Vietnamese, and others. And along with this enriching diversity came world-class NGOs, including the American Refugee Committee and the Center for the Victims of Torture, both of which call Minneapolis home. And the Twin Cities often boasts of having the most Fortune 500 corporations per capita in the country, and of course all of them are globally focused. And indeed, I'm not the only one who's noticed. Perhaps some of you read, as you picked up the New York Times last week, that their columnist Tom Friedman wrote about the increasing internationalization of his home state in a column that he called Minnesota Mirror. I'll read you the first paragraph, and he began by saying, quote, "I was debating whether to go to the Turkish-Syrian border this week or visit my old high school in Minnesota. I decided to make the exotic foreign trip and go to Minnesota. I thought it might be useful to look at this election through the window of my hometown of St. Louis Park. I have not been disappointed. I found this little suburb of 45,250 people outside Minneapolis, which was memorialized in the movie A Serious Man by the Coen brothers, who also hail from St. Louis Park, all the key trends impacting America." He continues to write, "For starters, there is the changing face of the town. We had 2 African Americans among the 2,500 students at St. Louis Park High when I graduated in 1971, and everyone there was either Christian or Jewish. When I walked through the high school cafeteria on Monday, there were 6 teenage girls covered in colorful Muslim headscarves, and the principal, Robert Metz, explained to me that, quote, today we have more Muslim students than Jewish students. This is the byproduct of a huge influx of Somali refugees to Minnesota. Metz said that my old high school, which now is an open enrollment, competes for students from around Minneapolis, attracts young people both for its academic rigor, it's an international baccalaureate district, and because they want to go to a richly diverse school that mirrors the world in which they'll be working. There are more than 30 languages spoken in the elementary school near my old house, exactly 29 more than when I lived there." End quote. Now, I also happen to live in St. Louis Park, Minnesota. And my first grader, Ian, goes to one of these incredibly diverse schools. His sister Sarah will join him there in kindergarten next week. And Tom Friedman wasn't exaggerating, at least if I even just look in my backyard, literally. And in fact, we ran Tom Friedman's column in our issue on Halloween. And so in the neighborhood Halloween party, where all the parents get together with the kids, at least for a moment or two, it was the talk at the table where people were getting ready before they went out to trick or treat. And I thought about it afterwards as I was preparing to talk today, and I just thought about the people who were standing around there. And the hosts hailed from California, and right before they moved into the house a few years back, they were expats in Hong Kong. And right across the street, there was a family from India who's come to work here because of Target, and they replaced the family who lived there who was from Ireland, who just built a house in the community. And right across from them, a new family has moved in. They were at the party as well, and they chose the community because it's in walking distance to one of 4 synagogues right there in the neighborhood that different families can indeed walk to. And if I think of our neighbors right next door, Kim is from a small Scandinavian Lutheran town in Minnesota, and she lived in Guatemala right before they got married and moved in. And Josh is from an Orthodox neighborhood in St. Paul, and he lived in South Africa studying archaeology before they got married as well. And those experiences are replicated all around the community, and I'm sure in your communities as well. And of course, while we were there, we didn't and don't focus on our differences, and we mostly discuss and are distracted by our kids, who on Halloween night were speaking today's universal language, superheroes and pop culture characters, which they, of course, were all dressed as. And I guess the point is that the Minnesota International Center gets this. and no doubt your councils do as well. Their programming reflects it, which not only connects Minnesota to the world, but often the community to itself. And they're not afraid to make their dialogue civil and even cerebral. It's never dumbed down, but it's always accessible. And in the process, they've made a mark in Minnesota, so they deserve a bookmark on a monthly basis on our page. And there still really is an appetite, I think is one real key finding that we've had from doing this and that we see at the newspaper, for establishment organizations and mainstream media sources, despite or perhaps because of the buffet of information and disinformation and misinformation, as we saw during the campaign a lot, and that the Pew poll was able to track. There's a hunger for voices vetted by the Minnesota International Center. And this hunger isn't just strictly an eat your peas type of meal. There's a whole lot of dessert served, literally and figuratively, at MIC events. World affairs, as you all of course well know, aren't just political and governmental. The cultural component, the root of what's so intriguing about internationalism is there too, and certainly reflected in this partnership. More and more people are seemingly taking notice. Carol mentioned the Great Decisions Conference that we had on global health. We had one in media last year. And among the striped pants set were a whole lot of t-shirts with high school and college logos. Because, as so many of you are finding out, increasingly, for young people, globalism is cool. And there's perhaps a whole new wave, just in the same way that our communities are changing, that perhaps your World Affairs Councils will be changing as well, if properly programmed and partnered even with some media in there. And so if the MIC, isn't just inspiring savvy veterans of world affairs to take a read and to consider the world more broadly, they certainly hopefully are doing the same thing with young people, and they may even be inspiring them to pick up the newspaper as well, which would be quite a welcome change also. In either way, it's a confirmation for us at the Star Tribune, and certainly hopefully for the people at the Minnesota International Center, that it's really the Star Tribune that should feel fortunate that the Minnesota International Center chose us to be their partner. Thank you very much.
Maybe there are a few questions, but something else that's so powerful about these articles, and Nellie, who's from my staff, Nellie McKay, what she's going to be handing out are samples. The first is the first article that we wrote, and I think I wrote the first article for MIC, which was, do you want to discuss foreign policy? I think that wanted to discuss foreign policy, right? And then John Rash's complimentary article was a partnership to explore world affairs. And then the second sample that we've given is we've taken the Great Decisions topic, which was exit from Afghanistan. And we asked one of our Great Decisions speakers, who had actually been a foreign policy officer in Iraq, and also done a lot of work in Afghanistan, to write that. And then John's article was for troops in Kuwait, technology is an oasis, and then he brought that Afghanistan topic into that. What happens when these articles are published in the Star Tribune is that we know that there are probably about 360,000 people that will subscribe to the paper that day and read that. So that really heightens the profile. So, yes.
I have a question about the relationship, is it entirely content-based and the relationships
Well, I'll first talk, and then I've been so persistent. I've been trying to get the Star Tribune to do this for 10 years. And so I talked to a number of other people in the editorial board, but I think that John was a new face at the Star Tribune in 2007, and we really started to develop that relationship by bringing all these international speakers to the editorial board, and he seemed to be very receptive. And then We took John and his boss, Scott Gillespie, the head of the editorial board, to lunch to talk about this. And I think it was helpful that when I gave the other case study of a very successful program like this, it had been at the Milwaukee Sentinel, and that's where Scott Gillespie got his career started. So I think that was helpful.
Indeed, and to Carol's credit, the first time we talked about it wasn't at lunch, and she had continued to bring international visitors to the newspaper. So a relationship had been established, as I know many of you already have with your local media as well. So we knew the organization, we knew, the thoughtfulness that they brought to bear on international issues, and so I think it really helped facilitate the dialogue.
Anything else? Yeah.
Had something like this going with the number of years ago on a Dale project. I think there are two reasons. One is that we run great decisions for 8 and 70 years to coincide with a college process and not the same time. So that's a little problem. I think the bigger issue, and John, I'd really be interested in knowing how you deal with this, is that we would have the speaker at that big great decisions event write this op-ed piece. And the paper was concerned with maintaining quality control. Each speaker, some write very well, sometimes the best lecturers are not necessarily the best writers. So they were just fidgety about committing to do something like that. And this was a serious issue. So how do you deal with that?
That's a very legitimate concern. It's a terrific question, and I can understand how that would vex an editor. What we do is, the Minnesota International Center is responsible in finding someone. Now, sometimes it is indeed that speaker, but most of the time, it's just someone who has a high degree of expertise, in this. And I mentioned the deep Rolodex, that Carol and the organization have. And, so one of the great decisions topics, if you remember, I think, was the oceans. And, when even a well-sourced editor doesn't immediately come to mind, particularly in landlocked Minnesota, who might be an expert on the oceans, and they found a terrific one in our backyard who, had some deep experience in terms of that, and had a very well-read piece on our page. And yet, this individual wasn't necessarily a speaker on it. Now, they can be, and Carol mentioned the former Foreign Service officer, a gentleman by the name of Tom Hansen, who beyond being, a well-skilled diplomat, is a very terrific writer. And, so, at times it can work really, really well. But more than anything, I think it's important for the editors to have the kind of relationship where we just find the best writer on a topic. And as you well know, sometimes the best sourced people on a topic aren't necessarily the best writers. So, part of it, you have to figure that out.
Yeah, because I think that we at the Minnesota International Center have to be responsible for finding that speaker. But the good thing is so these are the next year's topics. We're already, we spend a lot of time figuring out who are people that can be speakers on these topics in the community. And when we expect them to represent the Minnesota International Center in great decisions and go out, these are people that, in general, have so much expertise and are good writers. We have former elected officials, foreign service officers, a lot of academics, and I think that we've had, probably out of all last year, we had a very good track record for speakers, but then it's always edited as well. But what our MIC writers really value is that they get a byline. And it is so hard to get something in the, on the editorial page, and so they take this as a tremendous honor, and they work really hard on these editorials. And so I think you've been pretty pleased with that.
Absolutely, and yet you did mention one real key component here, just as I am, although they probably need it less than I do, but they do get edited. Now, that doesn't mean we change their meaning, their beliefs, their fundamental analysis, but certainly it can go through an editing process to clean it up a bit and to make it a little bit more linear at times. But that's a process that every writer who writes for the Star Tribune goes through.
Yes.
Carol, I look into the positions too, and my understanding seems like several different groups, it can be a group that can be started by anyone. And so, in our community, I see there's 2 groups already. I don't know how well established they are, but it sounds like you have something more of a, I don't want to call it a monopoly, but you have, it's pretty much centralized and it's going out of your council. So I can see how that partnership will work. But how do you, if you have your community where these different groups are forming their own kind of great decisions groups?
Yeah, if we hear about them, well, we've always had a really good relationship with the Foreign Policy Association in New York. So we would say, hey, has anybody from Minnesota purchased the books from Minnesota? And can you give us their name? Because we provide, training workshops for leaders, and we'll just want to bring them in and have them become a part of our organization. And so FPA has always been very open to providing us with that information, but also partnerships. So I've got my list of 60 groups. AAUW, you all have American Association of University Women. They love it. We do a lot of work with retirement homes. Retirement homes have a lot of really vibrant people that want to do a lot more than play bingo. And so that they've been really receptive. Of course, different places of worship, the library system. Libraries have loved this program. We provide really good content. Corporate, we've got corporate members, and so do a lot of the rest of you. We offer great decisions in the workplace. And so Target, Ecolab, Medtronic, they've had those. We've high schools. We have a number of high schools that have a great decisions program. And yeah, I think that's about it. So I think it's been a real win-win. And FPA has been a very important player in helping us to grow locally. And so I think that's where WACA can play this wonderful role with the Foreign Policy Association.
Maybe talk a little bit more about what kind of support FPA provides, besides the early money.
Right, so grants, I think they've also assisted us with the annual conference. They've sent out board members from the Foreign Policy Association. They've also asked me to come to New York City twice now to speak to their board of directors at the Foreign Policy Association, because this is a program that their board of directors want to know, well, what's going on in these World Affairs Councils and who has really vibrant, great decisions programs. And so that's been wonderful. And I think hopefully Noel is going to be here. Okay, great. But I think, next year, when you look at next year's Great Decisions topics, just listen to them, because I think FPA has been so good at just kind of taking the pulse on current events. And a lot of us look to these topics not only for our own World Affairs programs, but to know that this is something where you're going to be so current. So, the future of the Euro, Egypt, NATO, Myanmar in Southeast Asia, intervention, Iran, China and Africa, and threat assessment. And that's the one that includes global health. Yeah, Karen.
Yeah. Are they still doing that thing where they feedback to the State Department, feedback on American public opinion to the State Department?
Yes.
So part of the
Yeah.
Okay.
In a city that has many, not competing media sources, sort of is a suggestion to sort of have an exclusive partnership, maybe put a strategy together where you sort of segment the type of media that you should be paying type of media.
Well, I think for this particular partnership, we really wanted a newspaper. And we went to the biggest newspaper in Minnesota. But we also do a lot with Minnesota Public Radio and local newspapers, but I think this is really known as the gem, the star, and so we wanted to go to the top for this.
John, I'm sure there's some great universities that perhaps could do what Nick does in terms of provide that quality. Why not? I don't know what university there, but
University of Minnesota. Yeah, I love others. McAllister, Kofi Anderson.
It's a great question, and indeed, had we chosen to do something like this and said, let's approach the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota, we perhaps could have replicated. There's a couple different dynamics here. One is the institutional reputation of the Minnesota International Center was already very well established, very well thought of, and that was a positive that they had going for them. Two is that there's actually just a program put into place. And I think one of the key components of the success so far of this has been that there is the Great Decisions program that brings these topics out. So there's at least kind of a template in terms of, I think in every one that I've written about so far, there's almost a line that I have in the second paragraph, or the topic of this month's Minnesota International Center Great Decisions discussion. So there's an explanation in very shorthand for the reader. Why are we talking about the state of the oceans this month? Why are we talking about the Eurozone in January as an example, or whatever the topic may be? And certainly some of the people who Carol would be able to tap into, because of course there's a close affiliation between the MIC and the University of Minnesota, are key academics, professors and others at the university system, but it wouldn't necessarily be limited to that, and there are some really smart people from the business community that she's brought forward as well.
If you look forward to the next presidential election,
Started at about 1:15 a.m. last night.
how do you see the newspaper? What will it look like in a year? Will there be a print newspaper? Does that reduce the pressure on space? You can have a blog.
It's a great question, and the first thing I fundamentally will say is I don't know, and no one truly knows. Now that being said, part of it depends where you live. There are well-established, markets, communities that no longer have an everyday newspaper, and it's not just small ones. New Orleans, the most recent, Detroit, the biggest and most notable, as an example. I believe that at least for a generation, there will be a printed page, which is not me being a Luddite. I think people already have and will continue to have digital applications of the content. But there's a couple things. One is just from an advertising and business model, newspapers get far more per reader on the printed page than they do online. And particularly, the big challenge of what's happening online, and I don't decry this, it just exists and it has to be figured out like every business model, is devices are getting smaller and smaller. And if you think it's hard to get people to click through on an ad when they're on a laptop, wait until they're on a handheld, and Facebook is really challenged by this, right now as an example. If demography is destiny for international affairs and for media and for the election last night, there's an interesting demographic bump that's coming in that the number one reason people give, and maybe it's just Minnesota nice and they don't say it's because of your perceived leftward tilt, but the number one reason they give for canceling the paper is guilt. And the guilt is they don't get a chance to read it. It's not that they don't like it. They're going out the door and they have a baby in one arm and a briefcase in the other, and this is male and female, by the way, and they do a dance, and we've all done it, where you have these things in your arm and you're jangling your car keys and you're kicking the paper from the curb into the doorway, and then it's Friday and you come home and there are 5 blue bags, that haven't been opened. Well, we have this whole wave of baby boomers who are going to have some more time on their hand, and minimum investors, and many of them soon to be retirees. A lot of them may clearly want to find time for once and read the newspaper. and there's still a little bit of a romance to the printed page. You know, it's foldable, it's portable. It's not so fun to spill coffee on your iPad, but it's all right on the newspaper. And so I think it's going to hang out for a bit. I worry that it's going to be yet another stratification in our society in that only the affluent who can buy more time or buy the newspaper will have the printed page, and you know, far fewer of the people of modest means will have it. But I still think it's going to hang out at least for a bit. And I know the Star Tribune, as an example, is very committed to keep printing 7 days a week, because once you teach people to learn to do without something, it's awfully hard to get them to go back to it. So we don't want to get in that situation.
Hi, I wish I could agree with you on that generation before the newspaper is not here. I live in Harrisburg, and now the new house came, and also just reduced. And I think probably within the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see only a Sunday paper, and that's everywhere. But, you know, that's open. The one question I had for you was, I mean, I started journalism 30-some years ago, you know, but we're seeing so much more opinion from average reporters. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on that, if that's happening at the Tribune. We were just lamenting that one of our reporters who covers politics, the presidential race as well as the other races, actually had a separate column in which he said who he was voting for, which was, to me, unheard of. I mean, journalism school said that's Vermont, but yet is that happening where you are? Are you seeing that more?
Journalism school still says that, and our editors clearly say that, thank goodness, and I completely concur with you. I see more opinion laced in ostensibly objective reporting and some extraordinary circumstances like this. I can only speak for our paper, which tries to be very, very careful, certainly not in any kind of structured basis, as you know, in the situation you described, or even in an insidious basis. You know, people are human, and at times what they choose to not write about, or you know, quotes they choose to use or not use, can show, you know, some political perspective that they might have. So it's not perfect, but we still kind of go by the old model. Interestingly enough, though, since you mentioned it, our friends across the river at the St. Paul Pioneer Press have an extraordinary situation, and you being a journalism veteran would find this maybe even more remarkable. Their editor is also the editor of the opinion page, which, you know, those of us who, of course, have grown up reading newspapers or writing for them or learning about them, you know that there's always been this proverbial wall between the editorial page and the newsroom. At the Star Tribune, there's literally a wall, you know, between the two, and that's kind of an extraordinary situation that got quite a lot of notice because of an editorial they wrote just before our election about a constitutional amendment regarding same-sex marriage, and it became quite a controversy back home. But I say that parenthetically, but yeah, I see some changes out there, but at least most major newspapers are still trying to keep them separate.
Carol, in addition to the support to your dedication to the Foreign Policy Association, do you do any fundraising specifically around great decisions? Or how does that work?
Well, with our Great Decisions, all the leaders and the speakers absolutely have to be members. They want to participate in the program. And then we've done a lot of special membership initiatives to get people to become members. So for example, at the annual conference, if you come to the annual conference, you can get a free Great Decisions book for 2013 for this amount of money. So we've really put a push on trying to turn all these people into members. This last year, we kept our records. There were 429 Great Decisions meetings in Minnesota, and we had an attendance of 11,000 people. But it could be that if you belong to a Great Decisions group, you've gone to 8 of those sessions, so you're counted 8 times. But nevertheless, that's an impressive number of people in that community. And what the board has said is, let's, now you've really ramped up this program, let's now work harder to get them to become members. And so that's been a real initiative. But I think just being in the Star Tribune that's given so much credibility to our program. And people will say, oh yes, great decisions, third Saturday of the month in the Star Tribune. And then we can mention that because I think there are a few of the rest of you that are statewide. But, you know, somebody in International Falls, Minnesota, they might not be able to come down for our programs. But they're really proud to say, I belong to MIC, I'm a Greater Minnesota member, and I look forward to reading this every third week. So how are we doing for time? Oh my gosh. Yeah, I think, Dixie, did you have a question or comment?
I was going to follow a little more. I don't want to put you on the spot, but it's just, let me just is it possible, for example, to have Todd Culpepper as the national president of the World Affairs Councils of America submit an editorial to various papers around the country representing the entire system? A lot of our councils wouldn't have the wherewithal to write local editorials. Wondering what our system could do to help.
It's a great question, and of course that's possible, and you know the editor may clearly decide to run that. In terms of the program that we're describing, one of the things the editor likes about it is it brings in acknowledged experience and expertise for people who are local, and it's kind of the best of both worlds. You're certainly aware, many of us in this room are aware that there was a big movement in newspapers to go local, local, local was the mantra. And in reality, not everyone thinks that way, and increasingly they understand the interconnection between local and global. And even in this pocketbook election we just went through, well, the pocketbook is affected by globalism, and they do in some of these topics. But if we can bring in a local writer to express their perspective, that helps. Now, that being said, if Todd wrote a piece and sent it in, and it was about something that was, pertinent to what the commentary editor, not me, but what he would decide would be appropriate to run, absolutely, because we take national commentary all the time. And one quick thing I'd add on this is there are some tremendous foreign affairs, national security columnists in the country. One of them I'm proud is from St. Louis Park, Tom Friedman, Nicholas Kristof, many others, and probably don't all agree with everything that they say, but are really well steeped in their subject. The challenge is there are so few of them at this point, particularly because of how hard hit the newspaper industry has been with resources. So it's much more difficult, for newspapers to send someone overseas. I've been, very blessed in my brief career here in that, I've gotten to go report from Rwanda, and I went with the National Guard and headed to Kuwait, and I'm actually going to Turkey next week on a Thomson Reuters Global Security Conference. But that's relatively rare. I'm grateful to my colleagues and our leadership at the paper, but that's really rare in papers now. And so the challenge becomes for a commentary editor, if you're depending on the same voices again and again, this brings in local voices that aren't often heard from, have a local tie, but still can look at some international topics.
Yeah, Linda.
I had an editorial in the Kansas City Star about 3 weeks ago called Having an International Perspective, and I submitted it and just talked about having an international perspective, and that the International Relations Council was one way to get it, and there were others. I tried to be sort of open. I mentioned a lot of other organizations. I mentioned our academic World Quest, but also a lot of UN. And I tried to be submitted it and got it accepted. So even if you just write it, definitely send it in.
Right, and I think that, for the walkout leadership missions, those are fairly regular, and whenever I've gone on one, I've always written an article, hoping that it would get in the editorial board. I think I'm 1 for 5. But hey, I'm really proud of that one that did get published. But that's something that we can all do. All of us are leaders in this room, and we want to raise the profile, and as John said, they're always looking for good content, and we know that we could deliver that.
And just to let, we're working on that strategy now in our communications committee, and Anna Berry and I, who have some experience, are happy to help anybody shape an op-ed if you want to do it, or even give you ideas for writing one.
Yeah, and there are some wonderful journalists that are in the Walker system. You, Joyce, have had an illustrious career. You, Bill Crawford from World Boston. Any others? Be very helpful.
I was just going to say one thing that I know self-reported. One of the things that when you talk about having local, I used a sentence or quote from past culture or a quote from Carol Byrne or something and use it as part of what I'm saying so that it gives my local voice there, but it also gives some expertise and some knowledge that you all have from all of your experiences. So I think you can make a win-win situation out of it.
Wonderful, thanks. Good point. Claudia.
So this is slightly off topic but related. I just thought it would be good to encourage everyone to foster relationships with newspapers and other media outlets that may not be based in editorial or in content. We, for instance, with the Philadelphia Inquirer have had a relationship for about the past 8 years where they give us $65,000 worth of advertising, free advertising. And we treat them as a corporate sponsor. They are invited to give Tony Blair, and the publisher introduced him at the reception. So there is a quid pro quo, but it's a relationship that works for both of us. And we have, yes, we have some editors and foreign affairs, not writers, but people who at least have some knowledge on the topic come and moderate discussions and speak on occasion. Trudy Rubin, for instance.
Well, that would be so helpful for all of us to know what are some of the best practices that are happening in the field with regards to the media. I mean, I think that's something, again, that could be replicated one way or another.
We get some placement on the op-ed work. Yeah.
Bill.
John, I'm wondering if these articles, First Decisions articles, are ones that might be syndicated elsewhere in the state or regionally, or potentially could they be used nationally? If, for example, a number of counties or agencies form the partnerships that you have, and we have a conversation with different parts of the country on the same issues or different issues, we could follow them potentially to the national network, post them on the WAGA page, your paper credit, the author credit.
I'm honored that you would even consider that, and I certainly think something like that could be done. We haven't done that yet. I know there are mechanisms, of course, well established to do that. So, by all means, if anyone is interested, please let me know, and I'd be glad to discuss that. So, thank you.
Well, I want to thank you so much. And John is going to be around for the rest of the conference, so we're really happy that he's here. But also, we're just more than happy to talk to any of you, and I really hope that we can have the same kind of conversation at next year's conference to see how people are using Great Decisions and have strengthened their media partnerships. So thank you.